The silence before the shot, they called her the invisible one. Not because she couldn't be seen, but because no one bothered to see her. Her name was Mira Patel, and she lived in the quiet town of Willow Creek, a patch of countryside that hadn't seen excitement since the mayor's prize winning mysteriously exploded back in '08. Mira wasn't flashy. She didn't have a booming voice or a wardrobe that screamed, "Look at me." She wore hand-me-down jeans and soft flannel shirts. She walked like she didn't want to disturb the ground beneath her. She worked as a dishwasher in the back of a diner called Peggy's Place, where the plates were chipped, but the pancakes were divine. Her life was simple: work, home, feed the cat whose name was Hero, ironically sleep, repeat. But beneath that modest rhythm, Mira carried something few people noticed: a dream. Not a loud, glittering reality TV kind of dream. No, hers was quiet and strange. She wanted to learn archery, not just dabble in it, master it. Asterisk, why archery? It wasn't the hunger for medals or Olympic glory. It was something older, deeper. As a child, Mira used to sit with her grandfather, a retired forest ranger, and listen to his stories of wandering the woods with just a bow and a whisper of wind at his back. He told her archery wasn't about seeing the target hit, it was about feeling it. Hearing the breath of the world and answering it with silence and precision. Those stories carved something into her soul. The way rivers carve canyons, but life, as it tends to do, got in the way. After her parents passed in a car crash when she was 16, Mira gave up school, dreams, everything. She took care of her little brother until he was old enough to fly on his own, and then she just never started dreaming again until the summer of her 33rd birthday. Asterisk the Senate. This began with a flyer pinned to a community board outside the diner. Willow Creek Archery Club, beginner lessons now open. First session free, equipment provided, all skill levels welcome. Coach Rex VORN, she almost walked past it twice, but something maybe. Her grandfather's voice echoing in her heart made her stop. She tore off the little tab with the number and stuck it in her apron pocket. That night, over a cold dinner of rice and steamed broccoli, she looked at the number again. Then she called. Enter the coach. Coach Rex Vorn was everything Mira was not. Loud, commanding, and with a jawline sharp enough to slice cheese. He wore dark aviators even indoors and had biceps that clearly hadn't taken a day off since the Clinton administration. He welcomed Mira with all the warmth of a DMV line. "First-timer?" he asked, scanning her like she was a discount item. "Yes," Mira said, her voice calm. "You're holding the bow backwards." That was how the first lesson began. To be fair, she was holding it backwards. No, but she didn't think it needed to be said with quite that much sarcasm. The invisible one in action over the next few weeks. Mira came to every lesson, always early, always prepared, and always ignored. Rex had favorites, tall teens with fancy gear and fast reflexes. He focused on them, giving instructions like a general prepping his troops for war. Mira stood quietly at the end of the line, adjusting her stance from a YouTube video she watched during her lunch breaks. She missed every shot for 3 straight weeks, not even close. The arrows seemed magnetically drawn to the grass, trees, and once, tragically, a Gatorade bottle belonging to a very angry 10-year-old. Rex laughed once. "Maybe knitting's more your sport," he said, not bothering to hide it from the group. The others chuckled. Mira smiled softly, but inside something ancient stirred. Not anger, not shame, something else. Resolve, a stranger in the shadows. A particularly humid Thursday after another session of barely avoided humiliation. Mira lingered behind while the others packed up. As she picked up an arrow lodged in the dirt, a voice spoke. "You're listening to hard," she turned. A man stood at the tree line, older, in a weathered jacket, with a strange kindness in his eyes. He looked like someone who'd lived in the woods long enough to have polite conversations with squirrels. "I'm sorry," Mira said, startled. "You're trying to aim with your eyes. Don't. They lie to you. Bows don't speak to eyes. They speak to the gut, the heart." He walked over slowly, respectfully. "Close your eyes next time. Not all the way. Just enough to let the rest of you do the talking." Then he walked away. She never saw him at the club again. The next practice, Mira did something she hadn't tried before. She stood at the line, not looking at Rex or the others, or the target. She breathed. She felt the wind press gently against her cheek. Like a whisper, she half closed her eyes, and she pulled back the bowstring and trimmed. The arrow flew like before. Not like it was lost, but like it knew where it was going. It struck the outer ring of the bullseye. Silence, then Rex shouted, "Beginner's luck, do it again." So she did. Another hit, and another 6 in a row. All on target. 2 bullseyes that day. She didn't just get noticed, she made people blink. Rex's reaction, the smile, never reached Rex's eyes. He walked over and grabbed her bow, turning it in his hands like it had been possessed. "What'd you do?" he asked. "I listened," Mira said. He snorted and walked away. But the seeds had been planted. The eye of the heart. Over the next few weeks, Mira kept coming. She kept closing her eyes, not fully, just enough to feel. Her consistency was eerie. Other archers had good days and bad days. Mira, she was a metronome, calm, precise, unshakable. It was as if she saw the world not with her eyes, but with her intuition. By now, word had spread. "Have you seen the blind archer? She's like some kind of Zen warrior." "She's not blind," Rex would snap. "She's just weird." Weird or not, Mira was becoming unmissable. Asterisk the challenge one day. After yet another perfect round, Rex slammed his clipboard on the table. "Fine," he said, standing before the group. "Let's put it to the test." He held up a blindfold. "If you're so good with your eyes closed, prove it." The group gasped. Mira didn't flinch. She walked up, took the blindfold, and tied it gently over her eyes. The air held its breath. She breathed in. She aimed. She released THWIP. Bullseye. The silence was thunderous. Then someone whispered, "She doesn't need to see the target. She is the target." Echoes through the string. The day Mira landed the blindfolded bullseye, something invisible shifted, not just in the minds of the people watching, but in the atmosphere of the archery club itself. The silence that followed wasn't stunned or skeptical anymore. It had turned into a kind of reverence, the kind people reserved for witnessing something they didn't fully understand. In a world obsessed with performance, flash, and form, here was a woman in faded jeans, gently tying a blindfold over her eyes and hearing the arrows pass through the wind. Mira hadn't just hit a target that day. She'd cracked open an unspoken truth that greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. But that whisper now echoed louder than Rex Vorn could handle, though he had offered the blindfold challenge in front of everyone. Part of him had believed no expected Mira to fail. His years of coaching had taught him to trust the mechanics, the form, the repetition of muscle memory. Archery, to Rex, was a science. You calibrated your aim, calculated for wind, anchored your stance. Mira's fluid, almost meditative style made no sense to him. It was maddening. Worse, it was working. The moment her arrow struck the bullseye, Rex's authority began to tremble. A coach can't coach what he doesn't understand, and in Mira, he saw a force that didn't fit into his neat, structured mold. For Mira, however, the incident hadn't felt like a challenge. It had felt like a homecoming. She hadn't meant to embarrass Rex, and certainly not to become the center of attention. That wasn't her way. What she'd felt when blindfolded wasn't pressured, it was peace. For the first time in years, she had truly listened, not to voices or doubts or people trying to steer her off course, but to herself. And in that quiet, she had felt something deeper than accuracy. She had felt alignment. Yet success, especially the quiet kind, tends to breed its own storm. The next morning at the diner, Mira noticed people were watching her differently. Regulars who usually nodded and went back to their coffee now lingered. In conversation, strangers sat at the counter just to ask if she really shot a bullseye blindfolded. A couple of kids even showed up with toy bows and said they wanted to be quiet warriors like her. Peggy, the diner's owner, and a woman with exactly zero tolerance for nonsense, leaned over the kitchen pass and smirked. "You better not get famous." Can't find another dishwasher who actually shows up on time. Mira just laughed. But deep down, she felt something between discomfort and destiny stirring. At the archery club, things had shifted too. Students who used to ignore her were now watching closely.
Yes.
Some approached her with questions. One girl, maybe 12, asked if Mira could teach her the invisible way. Mira smiled and offered what advice she could, but always humbly, never claiming to have the answers. Her grandfather had taught her one simple truth. When you think you've mastered the bow, you stop learning. And Mira never stopped learning. Rex, however, had started unraveling. His teachings began to lean harder into discipline, form, and tradition. He no longer acknowledged Mira's shots during practice. When others complimented her, he would interrupt with dry corrections or theoretical jargon. "Sure, she hit the mark," he'd say, "but her elbow's off. Her anchor point is unstable. It's not sustainable." But the whispers grew regardless. Mira's name was starting to spread outside Willow Creek. A local journalist dropped by the club curious about the woman who sees with her soul. A regional sports blog mentioned her in a piece about unconventional athletes. Mira wanted none of the spotlight, but it followed her like a cat that had chosen its person. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the forest ridge, painting the range in amber and violet hues, Rex cornered Mira near the equipment shed. His voice was sharp, but his eyes betrayed something else, fear maybe, or a bruised kind of pride. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" he asked. "No," Mira said softly, tightening the bowstring with quiet hands. I'm just different." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're not a real archer. You're a trick, a novelty act. Real competition doesn't care about feelings. It cares about results." Mira met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "You've trained people to win. I'm training myself to listen. It's not a trick. That's practice." And with that, she walked away, bow in hand, hero trotting after her from where he'd been napping near the bleachers. Rex didn't speak another word that day, but his jaw tightened, like he'd bitten into something bitter. Later that week, a letter arrived for Mira. Not an email, not a text. A real, handwritten letter, sealed in parchment and delivered to the diner of all places. Peggy nearly dropped it into the mashed potato bin before noticing the name. Inside the envelope was an invitation to an underground archery exhibition held once a year in the northern woods. A quiet but prestigious gathering where archers from all walks of life were invited not to compete, but to share their craft, to display how they shot, not just how many points they scored. It was called The Circle, and it wasn't open to the public. You had to be invited. Mira was stunned. She had never even heard of it. Attached was a note in small, flowing script. "The wind speaks of you. We hope you'll answer." Rex saw the envelope in her hand the next time she showed up to practice. His face darkened like a storm cloud. "On the edge of a summer horizon, you don't belong there," he muttered. Mira paused, but her voice was steady. "Then it's a good thing I don't need to belong to anything to walk my path." That night, after feeding Hero and brushing the dirt from her boots, Mira sat outside under the stars, her grandfather's old journal on her lap. She turned the pages until she found one she hadn't read before. In it, he described a dreama, placed deep in the woods where archers gathered not for medals, but for meaning. He'd never found it, but he believed it was real. She ran her fingers over his handwriting and smiled. She would go, not for the attention, not for the fame, but for him. For her, for the silence between heartbeats, the breath before release, the string between the fingers and the soul. The forest of unspoken names, the journey to the circle was not marked by signs or maps. It wasn't found on GPS or mentioned in brochures. There was no website, no public event page, no commercial sponsor, just a set of coordinates scrawled in delicate ink on the corner of the letter, along with the cryptic words, "Come alone, but bring everything." Mira wasn't sure if that meant to bring her equipment, her past, or her soul, but she packed all three. She left Willow Creek at dawn, a quiet hum of anticipation tucked beneath her ribs. Hero, her ever-faithful cat, was left in the care of Peggy, who'd grumbled something about not being a furry babysitter, but promptly built the cat a throne out of milk crates and tablecloths. Mira carried with her only what she needed: her bow, a quiver of hand-fletched arrows. In her grandfather's leather-bound journal, worn soft with years of being held like scripture, the road became dirt, then gravel, then simply vanished into the forest. She parked the truck under a canopy of redwoods and stepped out, her boots sinking gently into moss. The trees loomed like elders, not frightening but immense, watching.
Ow.
Mira felt a shiver move through her, not from cold but reverence. Walked for hours, guided not by trail markers but by intuition. It was as if the forest itself had memory, whispering directions in the sway of the branches, the curve of roots, the tilt of light. She didn't question it. She followed. When she finally arrived, the clearing opened like a secret kept too long. A circle of ancient pines ringed the space, forming a natural coliseum of bark and silence. Around her, other archers stood, dozens, maybe 50 spaced evenly, quietly preparing. No one spoke above a murmur. They didn't need to. This was not a competition. It was a communion. And in the center, marked only by a low stone altar, was the sigil of the circle, an unbroken ring carved into wood, with no beginning and no end. A man in a linen tunic, face weathered but kind, approached her without introduction. He did not ask her name. Instead, he held out his hand, palm up. "You have brought your truth." Mira nodded and placed her grandfather's journal in his hand. He nodded, then handed it back without opening it. "Then you may stay." The sun filtered in through the leaves like golden breath. Each archer was given a position along the outer ring. The targets, curiously, were not visible. There were no bullseyes, no hay bales, no standard range setup. Instead, each archer stood before a stretch of forest, empty but expectant. Mira did not question it. She stepped into her place, unslung her bow, and closed her eyes halfway, just enough to see inside. A voice spoke then, not loud, but deep, like the ground itself had chosen to speak through human form. It was the same elder who had greeted her. "You will not see your target. You will feel it. You will not be scored. You will be known. You will not compete. You will reveal." The phrase echoed across the circle. Mira felt a chill climb her spine. And then, one by one, the archers began. There was no announcement, no countdown, just a rhythm. Like waves each, archer loosing an arrow, the strings released like a heartbeat skipping across space. Some closed their eyes, others muttered to themselves. A few sang softly in languages Mira didn't recognize. No one cheered. No one judged. This was not performance. It was prayer. When it was Mira's turn, she didn't move right away. She stood still, listening to the rustle of trees, the quiet creak of wood, the breath in her chest. She reached for an arrow, not by sight, but by familiarity, and knocked it gently. Her fingers found the bowstring like they'd always belonged there. She inhaled slowly until the world faded. She remembered being a little girl, watching her grandfather shoot at invisible targets in the woods behind their house, saying, "Feel the wind, Mira. It will tell you where the arrow needs to go." She remembered the nights after her parents died, sitting by the window with Hero curled in her lap, wondering if she'd ever find direction again. And she remembered Rex's disdain, his challenges, his disbelief, felt no bitterness, only understanding. His world had rules. Mira's world had resonance. She loosed the arrow. It sliced through the silence like a whispered truth and vanished into the forest. No applause followed. Just a shared hush, like the trees themselves were nodding. The rest of the day passed in that sacred rhythm. Some archers shot into the ground, others shot into the sky. Some hit nothing, others hit everything. But there were no failures here, spoken not in words but in arcs and flight, as the sun began to dip. The sun began to dip, the elder returned. He did not ask Mira how she felt or how she thought she did. Instead, he led her to a small fire at the edge of the clearing, where a few others sat in quiet conversation. One of them, a woman with long silver braids and hands stained with ink, smiled warmly. "You shoot like someone who's been lost," she said. Mira blinked, unsure whether it was a compliment. The woman continued, "That's good. Only those who've been truly lost know how to aim from the heart." Later that night, under a sky thick with stars, Mira was handed a wooden token carved with the same circle symbol. She was told nothing about its meaning. No one explained what she had accomplished or what came next. That was not the way of the circle. But as she held the token warm from the elder's hand, she felt something stir deep within her, deeper than talent, deeper even than memory, a sense of belonging, not to the group or the tradition or any title. For the first time in her life, Mira Patel knew that she was exactly where she needed to be. Not seen, not celebrated, just true as she left the forest the next morning. Following the sun's golden path through the trees, she did not feel like she was returning to the world. She felt like she was carrying a new world inside her, a world that could no longer be ignored. The return and the ripple when Mira stepped back into Willow Creek. The morning air felt different, as though the trees themselves bowed ever so slightly in quiet respect. The forest had not just been a detour or a weekend retreat, it had changed. Her she returned not as someone who had won anything, but as someone who had remembered everything. There was no medal around her neck, no trophy in her hands. But she carried something far heavier and more valuable than either, a profound, grounding certainty that she was no longer just someone with a bow. She was someone with purpose. The town, however, had been moving along its usual Axis coffee, poured at Peggy's diner with the same chipped mugs. Traffic lights blinking lazily through dust, kids on bikes weaving through the streets like dragonflies. Mira's disappearance for several days had stirred only mild curiosity, till word spread of her attending a mysterious gathering deep in the woods. The story had grown legs faster than a rumor in a high school hallway. Some claimed she'd been recruited by a secret society. Others said she'd joined a cult. One particularly creative theory involved ancient druids and a mythical arrow that could split mountains. Mira said nothing to confirm or deny any of it. Back at the Archery club, her return was met with an uncomfortable silence. The kind you get when someone walks into a room and all the air forgets what it's supposed to do. Rex Vaughan, naturally, was the first to fill that silence with skepticism. "Nice of you to rejoin the real world," he said, arms crossed. Eyes squinting beneath his sunglasses, which he wore even under the cloudy sky, like he had a personal vendetta against sunlight. Mira simply nodded, setting down her gear with the same quiet grace she always had. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not Rex. Not the curious stares from fellow club members. Not even the whispers behind her back that now grew louder. Bolder, but change once it starts. Never asks for permission. A few of the younger members, those who had once laughed at her or ignored her, now ask if she'd teach them. Not the technicalities, not the angles or the drills, but her way. The way that didn't rely on force or sight, but presence. Awareness. Stillness. Mira declined, at first gently but firmly. She wasn't a teacher, she said. She was still learning herself. But the questions kept coming. After practice one evening, a boy named Dorian approached her. 13 years old, gangly and nervous, with hands that trembled slightly when he knocked an arrow. "No, I'm not good," he said, staring at his sneakers. "Coach says I flinch too much and I hold my breath wrong. But when I saw you shoot, it was like you weren't afraid of the bow." Mira looked at him for a long moment and then said, "It's not about being unafraid. It's about being honest. The bow doesn't care if you're nervous. It only asks that you tell the truth." He blinked. "How do I do that?" "Start by listening," she said, "to everything." That evening marked the beginning of something Rex could no longer control. One by one, members of the club began to drift toward Mira after sessions. Not to abandon Rex's lessons. Many still respected his formality and structure, but to find balance. To ask questions, no drills could answer. They weren't asking Mira to replace Rex. They were asking her to open a door to something deeper. And she did, quietly and without ceremony, in the park on Sunday mornings or behind the diner after her shift. They called it the still practice, no targets, no scoring, no judgment. It's just breath, bow, and the moment. Rex was not blind to this. And as much as he prided himself on stoicism and rising above, Mira's rising influence gnawed at him. Not because she was taking over, but because she was doing what he could not, connecting. It's not instructing from above, but sharing from beside. One afternoon, he called a club-wide meeting. Everyone attended, curious, tense. Mira stood in the back, hands folded, calm as always. "I've given this club 12 years, Rex began, pacing like a general, preparing for war. "I've trained champions. I've built discipline, structure, pride. But now I see confusion setting in. Some of you are chasing shadows, whispers, magic tricks." The room was silent, save for a rustle of uncertainty. "I'm not saying emotion has no place in archery," he continued. "But this isn't therapy. It's a sport, a skill. We train to win, not to feel. That's the difference between a hobbyist and a true archer." And then, without naming her, he added, "If you want to wander into the woods and imagine targets, that's fine. But don't mistake poetry for precision." It was a direct shot, not with a bow, but with words. All eyes turned to Mira. She didn't bristle. She didn't defend herself. She stepped forward. Her voice was soft but clear. "I don't shoot to win. I shoot to remember." Rex chuckled bitterly. "Remember what?" "That I am more than a score," she replied. "I can be still. That I can trust myself." "You can't coach that," Rex snapped. "No," Mira said. "You can only live it." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like something had been named that had long gone unnamed. The meeting ended without resolution. Rex stormed out, and in the following days, something remarkable happened. The club didn't split. It grew. Rex's sessions continued with his loyal students, but Mira's quiet presence offered something different, complementary. Those who had once struggled with pressure and expectation now found peace in balance. For the first time, Willow Creek Archery Club wasn't just producing competitors, it was producing seekers, and among them was Dorian. Once shaky, now grounded, he no longer flinched. He no longer sought approval, just listened to the wind. The string, his breath, and let the arrow speak for him. One evening, as Mira packed up her bow under the golden hue of the setting sun, a voice called out behind her, still pretending to be some kind of monk. It was Rex. But this time, the bite was gone from his tone. Mira turned slowly, no pretending, just being. He approached, his usual bravado absent. "You changed them," he said, "not by force, not with medals, just by being yourself." Shrugged slightly. "That's all I ever had to offer." A pause. Then Rex looked her in the eyes and said, "I never understood your way, but I see now. It's not a trick." "No," she agreed. "It's a choice." Rex nodded slowly. "Maybe there's room for both." And just like that, the frost began to thaw. Not into a friendship hat, at least not yet, but into something more important, respect. That night, as Mira walked home under the indigo sky, the token from the circle nestled in her pocket, she felt the wind rise softly against her cheek. Not a gust, not a warning, just a gentle, guiding push. She smiled. The arrow was still flying. The demonstration of light and shadow by late autumn, the wind had turned sharper in Willow Creek. Laced with the dry rustle of falling leaves and the first hints of frost that crept along the morning grass, the town, unchanged in many ways now, carried a subtle tension beneath its surface. Mira Patel, once invisible, once underestimated, had become something of a local symbol. Not of victory or conquest or trophies, but of quiet transformation. She had become a living reminder that greatness often begins not with noise, but with stillness, Her presence had shifted the energy of the archery club, reshaped the dynamic between coach and student, and introduced something foreign to the rigid structure of competitive training: intuition. She hadn't overthrown Rex. She hadn't needed to. Instead, she'd carved out a second path, not in opposition, but in parallel, a path of breath, balance, and listening. In a small town like Willow Creek, that was revolution enough. But revolutions rarely go unnoticed. One cold Tuesday morning, Mira received a call from the county events coordinator, a woman named Clarice Beaumont, whose voice sounded like she never had less than 4 espresso shots in her system. Mira Patel. Yes, hi, hello. You don't know me, but I know you. And I need to ask you something both terrifying and exciting. Would you consider performing a demonstration at this year's Regional Sports and Wellness Expo? Myra blinked, caught off guard. She was standing in Peggy's place with a plate of hash browns in one hand and Hero winding around her ankles like a persistent toddler. I'm not really a performer, Mira said slowly. I know, Clara said. Why, I want you. Everyone's talking about the way you shoot. How you don't look, how you listen, how you what was it, Toyes? See with your soul? People want to see that. Mira hesitated. Her instinct was to say no. She had no interest in becoming some sideshow for curious onlookers. Her gift was personal, sacred. But Clarice, sensing hesitation, added softly, it might help others find their way.
Oh, wait.
People who think they don't belong in sports. People like you once were. And that, more than anything, shifted something in Mira's chest. She said yes. Event was scheduled for the last weekend of October. Held in the neighboring town of Oak Ridge, the Regional Expo was a big deal for their quiet part of the state. Booths, tents, sports clinics, food trucks, and everything from CrossFit to yoga to martial arts exhibitions. Myra was assigned the final demonstration slots Sunday evening just before the closing ceremony as the headliner. As the date approached, Mira prepared in her own way, not with rehearsals or choreography, but with long, meditative sessions in the woods. She practiced blindfolded not to dazzle, but to ground herself. She shot in silence, in wind, in darkness. She even tried shooting in the rain, letting the droplets drum against her skin like a rhythm section of the earth itself. The day of the expo arrived with cool blue skies and the sweet scent of roasted almonds in kettle, corn drifting between the booths. Mira arrived early, dressed in her usual earth-toned layers, her grandfather's journal tucked in her pack. She avoided the main paths, preferring the quiet edges of the fairground where she could observe without being seen. As she waited for her demonstration slot, she watched other performers, martial artists breaking boards, gymnasts flipping through the air, even a team of synchronized jump ropers who moved like human metronomes. She wondered briefly what she was doing there. She didn't have the flash. She didn't have a performance face. She didn't have a stage voice. What she had was stillness. And in that moment of doubt, she reached into her bag and opened her grandfather's journal to a page marked with a leaf from long ago. There in his careful handwriting was a passage she had overlooked before. I used to believe the bow made me powerful. But over time I realized it was not power I found in the draw. It was peace. In the tension between pull and release, I found who I really was. Mira closed her eyes. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to share peace. When her name was called over the loudspeaker, she stepped onto the demonstration field slowly, almost reluctantly. The crowd was larger than she expected. Maybe 200 people gathered around the open range, curious, expectant. At the edge of the field, Clarice gave her an encouraging nod and a thumbs up, so enthusiastic. Nearly knocked over a sandwich stand. Mira took her place at the line. A single target stood 50 feet away, standard concentric rings. Nothing special. But instead of facing it directly, Mira turned her back to the crowd for a moment and closed her eyes. She tied the blindfold around her head, not dramatically. Not for show, but with reverence. As if she were preparing for something sacred. The whispers began immediately. She's not going to actually shoot like that, is she? She can't even see. She's that woman from the forest event, right? Mira tuned them all out. She inhaled deeply. The sound of her breath filled her ears like waves. The wind brushed her left cheek. A bird chirped behind her. A child coughed in the crowd. She didn't filter any of it out. She absorbed it, accepted it, became part of it. Then she drew the bowstring back. Silence, and then thwip. The arrow flew, cutting the air like a thought. THWACK. Dead center. Bullseye. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Mira did not bask. She knocked a second arrow. Again, she listened. Again, she released. Again, bullseye. She continued. 5 arrows in total, all blindfolded, all accurate. But the 6th arrow, this one she knocked, and then paused. She let the silence stretch. And instead of shooting at the target, she turned slightly and aimed upward. Toward a pine board hung with a simple paper circle attached in. Off angle, not part of the formal setup, she loosed the arrow. It curved with the wind, slipped between the tree trunks, and punched through the paper cleanly. The audience didn't cheer. They just stood, stunned, unsure of how to react to something that felt more like a prayer than a performance. Mira removed the blindfold and bowed her head, hands folded over the bow. When she looked up, she saw someone at the edge of the crowd she didn't expect. Rex. He hadn't clapped. I hadn't whistled. But he was there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Later, as the crowd dispersed and Clarice practically vibrated with excitement at how the video was going to explode online, Mira quietly packed up. She didn't crave the noise. Had done what she came to do, but before she left, Rex approached. "You still shoot like you're dreaming," he said. Mira offered a small smile. "It's not a dream, it's a memory." Rex studied her for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. Inside was a small brass pin shaped like an arrowhead, tarnished. "Old but well crafted. I found it in my first tournament bag years ago," he said. "Didn't know why I kept it, but I think it was waiting for the right archer." Mira didn't speak. She simply accepted it. As she turned to leave, the late sun painted long shadows across the field, and she felt the gentle weight of the pin. In her hand, it wasn't an award, it wasn't a title, it was something else. Recognition, and maybe the beginning of something even greater. The arrow within it began not with a letter or a phone call or an invitation, but with a box. A plain, unmarked cardboard box, resting on Myra's front porch as if it had been placed there by the wind itself. No label, no sender, just her name. Handwritten in quiet, deliberate cursive, Mira. She found it one early morning, as frost still clung to the railings, and Hero pawed half-heartedly at an acorn on the steps. Something about the box's presence stopped her in place. It wasn't threatening, just ... heavy. Not in weight, but in intention. Like it carried the echo of a voice long gone. Inside the box was a collection of items wrapped in old fabric. A sealed envelope, a leather strap, a polished arrowhead, a faded photograph of her grandfather in his forest ranger uniform. Standing beside a woman Mira had never seen before, sharp-eyed, confident, with a bow slung across her shoulders. And at the very bottom of the box, hidden beneath layers of folded wool, was an old wooden case, bound with string. She untied it, hands trembling ever so slightly, and opened the lid. Within it rested a single arrow longer than the one she used, handmade with deep red fletching and a dark wooden shaft carved with intricate symbols she didn't recognize. It was unlike any arrow she had ever seen. Not ceremonial, not decorative, but purposeful, meaningful. It was then she opened the envelope. The letter inside was in her grandfather's handwriting. Though she had read his words in his journal countless times, these lines felt different. They felt final. "Mira, if you're reading this, then you found your way back not to me, but to yourself. This arrow was made not for sport or hunting or war. It was made for clarity, symbol of what the bow was always meant to be, a mirror, not a weapon. You've probably guessed by now that I wasn't always the quiet ranger people remembered. There were years, darker years. Regret has its own kind of echo, and it took me decades to stop running from mine. But you are my echo answered. You didn't just pick up a boo. Picked up the part of me I thought I'd buried for good. You carried it further than I ever did. The woman in the photo is Asha. She was my partner, my student, and your grandmother. Mira stared at the page as her breath caught in her chest. She had never known her grandmother. Her father rarely spoke of her, and her mother even less. All she knew was that her grandparents had separated young, and that her grandfather had lived out the rest of his years alone in the woods. But now, through this single page, decades of silence cracked open like dry earth after the first rain. The rest of the letter went on to explain that Asha had been a gifted archer, one who shot not for victory, but for vision. She had taught Mira's grandfather how to feel instead of fight, how to listen instead of lead. They had fallen in love in the mountains, but war, injury, and grief had driven them apart. The arrow had been hers, handcrafted during her final days, when illness stole her strength but not her spirit. She asked him to pass it on not to a winner, but to a witness, to someone who could see what archery really was, and so it had waited. Until now. For hours, Mira sat on the porch, the arrow cradled in her lap, the letter pressed against her chest. Her mind wasn't spinning, it was expanding. Every moment she had stood at the range, every shot she had made with her eyes half closed, every breath she'd taken before release it, had all been part of a legacy she never knew she was part of. She had not inherited a skill. She had been called by it. The days that followed were quiet ones, not idle, but introspective. Mira took time away from the club, from her Sunday sessions, from the growing whispers of media interest that now buzzed. Around her like bees near honey, she needed silence. It's not the kind that came from absence, but the kind that came from presence. She walked through the woods every morning, not shooting, just listening. She carried Usha's arrow with her, but never drew it. It was not meant to be loosed casually. It needed a moment, a reason. That moment came 1 week later. The town council, inspired by her recent demonstration, invited her to speak at the unveiling of the new Willow Creek Community Center. It would be built on a plot of land near the river, next to where the Archery Club had first started, a symbolic bridge between past and future. Mira, initially hesitant, realized this was more than just a speech. It was a closing of a loop. A full circle at the ceremony, a modest crowd gathered, familiar faces from the diner. Students from the club, even Clarice in a dramatic scarf, far too warm for the weather. Rex stood off to the side, arms crossed as always, but this time there was no scowl, just a watchful stillness. Dorian, her young protege, beamed from the front row. Mira took the small stage with quiet confidence. No microphone, no script, just her voice. "I never wanted to be known," she began. "I wanted to be understood. I used to think being invisible meant I didn't matter. But now I see that the things that grow in silence often grow the deepest. Archery taught me that. Or rather, it reminded me." She held up the arrow. This belonged to a woman I never met, my grandmother, Asha. She shot not with sight, but with soul. She believed a bow is not something you hold at something. You become. And she passed that belief down without even knowing me until now. She stepped down from the platform, walked toward the edge of the field, and readied her bow. She knocked Usha's aeronaut to impress, not to demonstrate, but to honor. She closed her eyes, and in the silence, she felt everything: the wind, the heartbeat of the earth, the legacy in her blood, the weight of the past, and the lightness of letting it go. Then, with a slow exhale, she released. The arrow arced high, sailing with a grace that defied gravity and memory alike. It struck a tall pine near the river, embedding itself deep, not centered on a target, not framed for applause, but exactly where it needed to be. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They felt it as the wind stirred the branches, and the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the hills. Mira stood quietly, her hands empty, her heart full. The demonstration was over. The performance was complete. But her story, it was just beginning. For Mira Patel, the invisible woman who had once been ignored, dismissed, and doubted, had become something no one could overlook, not a champion in the traditional sense, but something far rarer. A keeper of stillness, a steward of truth, an archer of the unseen. The end.